Well, what a race the Austrian Grand Prix was, producing a dramatic late collision between Max Verstappen and Charles Leclerc as Max Verstappen went on to take victory in the race. Of course, also Honda's first in Formula One since coming back as an engine supplier in 2015. But of course, all the talk was about that incident, the fact that Max Verstappen was not given a penalty that would have cost him victory. Now, I'm joined by Scott Mitchell to discuss this. And Scott, obviously, a few weeks ago we had the Canadian Grand Prix. Sebastian Vettel was given a penalty. There was outcry about that. They couldn't find a way to not penalising him. But we come here, different incident, different type of incident, but Verstappen could easily have been penalised, but he wasn't. So what was the reasoning?
Well, I think it's fair to say that we all expected there to be a penalty. You and I and everyone watching were disappointed, I think, at some point over the Canada and France weekends because there were penalties, maybe rightly applied in terms of the letter of the law, but wrongly applied in terms of the spirit of racing. So I think we all expected that Max would get punished. There was contact, he was the aggressor, and the leading car, Charles Leclerc on the outside, was forced off the road. So it all seemed to add up to a slam dunk penalty, but actually, like anything in motor racing, everything comes down to the fine details and the nuances of the clash. And the key difference, which for this incident compared to Vettel in Canada and Ricciardo in France as well, because I'm sure there's a lot of people who draw similarities, and Mattia Binotto, Ferrari team principal, said there are clear rules that exist to prevent this sort of thing, and these have been applied in recent races. So everyone from media, fans to the teams involved thought there were similarities to what happened before. The key thing is that with Vettel and Ricciardo, they went off track and they were rejoining the track, and it was a manner of either rejoining unsafely or the fact that they forced someone else off after rejoining. And the difference here is this was just a legitimate overtake attempt from Verstappen. He was in control all the time. It was hard, fair. He gave Leclerc room most of the way around the corner until the geometry of the corner goes against two cars running side by side because it tightens naturally. And the stewards basically used this as an opportunity to say neither driver was it wholly or predominantly to blame. Is that right?
Yeah, that's the level you need for there to be a penalty. One driver has to be considered wholly or predominantly to blame. Now, this was brought in a few years ago in order to cut back on the number of penalties.
Yeah, exactly. So that was actually quite... I'm not saying that the stewards went, loophole, we've got it. I think it's more of a, well, here you go. We've actually got an opportunity now to interpret the situation. And I think you were saying this last night when we were talking about this, because unsurprisingly we've been talking about this extensively over the last 12 hours, that it's that opportunity to redefine what's acceptable. And the thing in Canada with Vettel, and to a greater or lesser extent with Ricciardo in France, is there wasn't really any room for interpretation. A car had gone off track, they'd rejoined and then tried to continue with a manoeuvre or make a manoeuvre that caused problems for another driver and forced them off the track. So really they were banged to rights. The key thing here is that the stewards were able to say that even though Leclerc was on the outside and he feels the aggrieved party, and some people will think he was the aggrieved party, there was just that little bit of responsibility on his part to avoid an accident, which meant that they didn't entirely blame Verstappen.
And obviously the key thing is the dynamics of this accident. Leclerc went to the outside. He left the door open for Verstappen to go out the inside. Verstappen made the move on the brakes up the inside. He was well alongside Leclerc, so it wasn't one of those ones where a driver comes steaming in on the brakes and into someone. We've seen people penalised there at that corner for that before. Carlos Sainz last year, if memory serves, I think was done for it, or the year before. So it wasn't an out of control attack. So you then got a situation where you've got two cars side by side. Leclerc's chosen the outside. And the way I put it is there's an element of live by the sword, die by the sword here. Leclerc's taken a risk. He knows the outside you risk being hung out to dry. And this to me seems to be the key thing, that the stewards have said, well, you made that decision, so you did contribute in a man, even if he's the minority partner, because he was run off the road. So I understand why he's frustrated. But I think, as you say, the great thing is this has set a precedent. I mean, it's in line broadly with some of the things we've seen before, but I do think there's a slight shift. The stewards won't have failed to be aware of the wider context with the debate about penalties, etc. They can't avoid it. And I think there was a chance to really look at it and set this precedent that will set a slightly higher bar for when drivers should be penalised. And I think that's very, very important for the future in this let them race spirit that everybody keeps calling for.
Especially in a world where at the moment F1's not coming off too good. And I think this was the right decision for F1 in terms of the context of the time, even though personally, and I think we disagree on this slightly, personally I don't think that the wider picture should influence it, because it's all
well should should it and does it,
Yeah.
different things.
Absolutely.
It's the same as if you have a legal case where a precedent's being set and the judge will know that this is something that will have an impact down the line. It's a more momentous decision. I think that's why they can't have failed to do it. It doesn't necessarily mean they change their decision, but they might have deliberated over it a little bit longer and thought, actually, this is more than just about today.
The thing for me that I thought was quite interesting was speaking to race director Michael Masi afterwards, just sort of trying to get his view on the significance of this decision off the back of Canada, off the back of France, in the middle of all of this, what's for the greater good of F1, is him just saying that you've just got to treat each incident individually. You can't go into it thinking, right, we know that we're going to be expected to do this, so let's mix it up and do something different. Or, right, well, we've given this guy a penalty before, they made contact, so it's a penalty. You can't be influenced by precedent in the sense that just because that decision has been made, the same one has to be made. And this is where that interpretation comes in and is important.
Precedents are set and reset. That's how it works.
Exactly. And one of the examples that the stewards used in deciding this was the clash between Hamilton and Rosberg at the same corner in Austria 3 years ago. And the key difference there is, even though it looks like an identical accident, because you've got a car on the inside out running wide and then the car on the outside gets forced off the road, it's different because this year Verstappen's the aggressor on the inside. He's trying to make an overtake and Leclerc's hanging on around the outside. On the case of Hamilton and Rosberg in 2016, Rosberg's defending on the inside and he's trying to force Hamilton out wide in defence. It's a different accident, even though it looks the same and it's similar outcomes and all of that. It is fundamentally different. So you can't just say, "Wow, this happened before." It was like in Canada when Vettel got punished, and afterwards people found the video of Hamilton squeezing Ricciardo on the exit of the chicane in Monaco.
Different.
They're different accidents, and you've got, in one situation you've got a wall right to the outside, in another situation you've got curb and a bit of runoff and then the wall. So things change. And the other thing that I found really interesting that Masi said is that when it comes to the drivers themselves and the conduct that they show on track, is they have been influenced by the runoff, the growth of runoff. So if there's a wall on the outside, the guy on the outside is more circumspect. He makes the decision, right, do I contest this or do I not? Because I know there's a chance I'm going to get shoved into the wall, because that's just the way physics works. That car is going to move to the edge because we've got a tightening apex. So if there's a wall there, I'm probably going to go into it. Maybe I'll back out of this. But because there's this proliferation of runoff now, the guy on the outside is now more inclined to just keep his foot pinned, hope that he stays on track, but if he doesn't really lose anything. And because of the way that the rules have gone, there's also the chance that there'll be a penalty for the guy on the inside, and that's not really good racing for me. I think the way that this decision has gone and the precedent that this now sets, I think it's quite interesting in terms of shaping the rules of racing in Formula One going forward. Well,
it also brings back the idea of seeding a corner. 30 years ago, if that was a wall or a gravel-lined corner, then you would have seen Leclerc probably thinking, I'm going to run out of space, so I'll back off here. There is always a risk from being on the outside in corners. That's just the way it works. And he made that decision to leave the door open and take the outside line. It doesn't mean that you have to let anyone through who comes steaming up the inside. It's not just a charter allowing drivers just to pile into each other and force people off track. But it does create this sort of grey area where if there's a bit of contact, things are a little bit marginal. I don't blame Leclerc for being annoyed about it. You can let it happen and say, actually, that's hard racing. And then next time, maybe Leclerc gives Verstappen a little bit of a shove. It's not particularly dangerous. It's not particularly problematic. And I think what we've got here is the way the stewards have approached this, the way they thought about it, the way they've interpreted it, has set a very encouraging tone. I don't think it means it's open season, I'll do what you want. That's the really, really important thing. And it's going to be down to drivers to accept that, because all the drivers keep saying, oh, let us race and we don't want all these penalties. But then, of course, if you're someone like Leclerc who's potentially lost a Grand Prix win to that pass, and of course it's a moot point whether he'd been passed later anyway, because he was struggling on pace and Verstappen was quick even though he was close to the end of the race. It's also incumbent on drivers to accept, well, this is what we kind of ask for, and we kind of understand what these rules of engagement are now. So that's great for F1. I think that made the Austrian Grand Prix a really good race for Formula One, not just for the day, but for the long term.
Absolutely. It became a 50-50 fight between Leclerc and Verstappen up the hill, 2 laps in a row. And some people are saying, well, the lap before they didn't make contact and Verstappen didn't get through, so that proves that it can be done side by side. But no, it doesn't. All that shows is that by giving Leclerc too much room, Max couldn't make the pass. So that doesn't mean that he's then entitled to just throw it up the inside and shove Leclerc off the track. And there you go, we're through and in the lead. It's more that Max changed his approach into turn 3 the second time. He braked later, he ran deeper into the corner. And therefore, it's a different incident. It's a different move to the one that happened a lap previously. The lap previously, Max was slightly more conservative. He wasn't quite as far into the corner. So Leclerc was able to have that room around the outside. This time, Max got far enough alongside early in the corner for that corner to be his, fundamentally. And the nature of that corner, it sort of crests in the middle and it tightens on the exit, means that that car on the inside is always going to wash out towards the edge. And this goes back to what we said, to take your terminology, Leclerc chose to live and die by the sword there. He could have just conceded it and gone, well, I'm out, I've given it my best go, but he's got me here. And he didn't. He tried to tough it around the outside, probably because he knew that he would either be able to run a little bit wide and maybe keep the position, or if he got pushed off, maybe there'd be a penalty, which isn't right. And I personally wouldn't have seen a guy like Charles Leclerc take his first win in Formula 1 because of a post-race penalty. So I think it's right. I think it's ended up being the right decision in many ways, even if you're not necessarily the biggest fan of a driver losing a win because they've bumped wheels and been pushed off the track.
Well, the important thing about this race, I think, is regardless of whether you're cheering for Leclerc or Verstappen, for Red Bull or Ferrari, or you don't mind, the bottom line is this has actually set a nice precedent. I think it's very, very good for the let them race philosophy everyone wants to see. And I think this is very, very positive for the future of Formula 1. So thanks very much to Scott Mitchell and the many Austrian insects that joined us. And let's hope we see much more hard but fair, shall we say, racing, if it was at the upper end of that for Max Verstappen in the future. Because now what the Austrian Grand Prix showed is that this let them race mantra really is starting to deliver results.